In 1992, a so-called bottomless pond in eastern China was finally drained. What appeared underneath wasn't a natural cavern or a collapsed mine or a simple cistern. It was a carved chamber, vast, geometric, and intentionally finished. Then another pond was drained, then another, and more chambers appeared, each one cut into rock with repeating, deliberate chisel band patterns running across the walls like a signature. Here's the part that doesn't sit right. A project that big should leave a trail: worksite debris, tool caches, hauling routes, spoil piles, administrative records. But in the public record, the story feels oddly incomplete. And that's the question we're opening with. Not whether ancient people could cut stone, they obviously could, but why a mountain-sized effort can survive underground while the evidence that explains it feels so thin. This isn't a video about ancient aliens. It isn't about secret super civilizations. Every site in this list is real, documented, excavated, or studied by modern researchers. And when the evidence is uncertain, we'll label it clearly. Because all 7 places share one connecting pattern, and once you see it, underground mysteries stop feeling like impossibilities and start feeling like something more unsettling: history with its paperwork missing. We'll move from Turkey to Malta, from Greece to Egypt, through tunnels and underground works that don't neatly match the tools, the organization, or the records we expect for their time. And then we'll return to those Chinese caverns, because they're the clearest case file that still doesn't close. But first, we start somewhere familiar: Cappadocia, where the landscape almost invites humans to disappear beneath it. Derinkuyu is often described as an underground city discovered after a hidden opening was found inside a home, an entrance that led to a much larger system. The claim is that it's multi-level, deep, and engineered for people: ventilation, chambers, corridors, and defensive features that suggest planning rather than accident. The official explanation leans heavily on geology. Cappadocia's volcanic tuff is relatively soft compared to granite, and that makes extensive carving far more achievable with the kinds of hand tools ancient societies could realistically have. That answers the first question: how the rock could be cut. But here's the but. Softness doesn't automatically create an organized underground city. Scale implies coordination, phases of expansion, labor management, maintenance, and a reason to keep returning underground over time. And even basic questions like the site's true peak capacity are debated, because famous places attract inflated numbers and simplified narratives. So Derinkuyu becomes our trust builder. Yes, ancient people could carve deep spaces. Yes, there are reasonable explanations. Yet the case still leaves a gap that matters for the theme of this video. The mismatch here isn't stone versus tools, it's scale versus story. If this is the explainable example, the next site strips away even that comfort, because Long Yu isn't famous for what's there, it's famous for what's missing. Long Yu begins like folklore. Ponds locals called bottomless, not because they were mystical, but because nobody could reach an end. Then the ponds were drained, and enormous man-made caverns emerged. Multiple chambers, often cited as around 24, each carved with interiors that look finished, not crude. Walls and ceilings covered in consistent parallel chisel bands, as if the builders cared about uniformity, not just empty space. The claim is unmistakable. This wasn't one person digging a shelter. This was organized excavation. Official explanations vary: quarrying, storage, military use, or an unknown function, but none of them neatly close the file. Because the but hits in 3 places. First, the volume. Removing that much material should leave obvious spoil trails somewhere nearby, yet there's no single widely accepted answer for where a mountain's worth of rock went. Second, the tools and worksite traces. Not because ancient people had no tools, but because you'd expect tool debris, staging areas, and evidence of long-term workflow that matches the scale. Third, documentation. Even if a project wasn't celebrated, scale creates bureaucracy. Food, labor, transport, management, yet the surviving narrative doesn't seem proportionate to the effort. So this is where the title lands hard. If the timeline and scale are correct, the physical work implied here doesn't match the amount of tool and worksite evidence the public story can confidently point to. And now the question becomes sharper than how did they cut? It becomes, why does something this massive survive as architecture, but not as a well-documented human project? Hold that thought, because the next place shows that underground work wasn't always built for refuge, storage, or secrecy. Sometimes it was built like a destination, an interior world designed to be entered, used, and remembered by the people who built it, even if we're still arguing about why. The Hal Saflieni Hypogeum in Malta changes the mood of this entire list. This isn't one tunnel you pass through, it's a subterranean complex of chambers shaped with intention, often discussed in connection with ritual and burial activity. The official explanation, at a broad level, places it in ceremonial and mortuary use, an underground architecture tied to belief in community practice. But the but is what makes it relevant here. Underground sites can preserve spaces while thinning out the clues that explain exact purpose, sequence, and everyday use with absolute certainty. The mismatch isn't that ancient people lacked tools, it's that the deeper the site, the easier it becomes for context to vanish through disturbance, later activity, restricted access, or simply the passage of time. In other words, we can still walk the chambers, but the evidence that would let us close the file often doesn't survive in neat, date-stamped pieces. And that creates a different kind of tension, because once underground spaces become sacred or feared, they can become protected in a way that blocks investigation. Which leads to the next site, where the biggest obstacle isn't engineering, it's access. Because in Mexico, some underground stories weren't just forgotten. According to accounts, they were shut down. Mitla is known as a ceremonial complex, but beneath the surface, a parallel narrative persists, rooted in tradition and echoed through later descriptions. Underground chambers linked to an underworld concept, a threshold between worlds. The official explanation frames Mitla within cultural and ceremonial architecture, where subterranean chambers can exist for reasons ranging from burial practice to ritual design. But here's the but that keeps this story unresolved. You can't date what you can't reach, and you can't confirm what remains sealed. Across underground archaeology, access is often the real gatekeeper. Safety concerns, ethical restrictions, later structures built on top of older ones, and the simple fact that digging in the wrong place can destroy the very evidence you're trying to preserve. Some historical accounts describe underground passages with emotional detail: cold air, foul atmosphere, a sense of danger. Whether those descriptions were literal, exaggerated, or shaped by worldview, the outcome is the same. The story becomes partially sealed behind later history. Modern geophysical surveys can suggest voids without digging, but a signal isn't automatically a mapped tunnel, and without direct excavation, tool marks, construction layers, and datable material remain limited. So in terms of the title, Mitla's mismatch is straightforward. You're asked to evaluate construction and age without the full set of physical clues, because the site's underground evidence is not fully available to examine. Which makes it the perfect bridge to the next entry, a place where access exists, purpose is practical, and the case file becomes far easier to explain. And that contrast is the whole point. The Tunnel of Eupalinos on the Greek island of Samos is often described as an engineering masterpiece, a water tunnel cut from two ends intended to meet, an achievement that implies planning, measurement, and disciplined execution. The claim is practical and clear: an organized workforce carved a functional tunnel through rock to solve a real-world problem: water supply. The official explanation is exactly that. This is ancient engineering behaving the way engineering usually behaves, when purpose is defined and planning is strong. And here's the but, and it's not a criticism, it's a clue. When we have a stated purpose, the mystery shrinks. When documentation survives, the timeline stabilizes. When a tunnel is part of infrastructure, it leaves a trail that makes sense, planning, function, and evidence that points in the same direction. Which makes the other sites feel stranger, not because ancient people lacked ability, but because so many large underground works survive without the context that makes them easy to interpret. So now we move to Egypt, where the underground isn't just about cutting rock, it's about moving mass through confined space, where tools of the time aren't questioned because people were incompetent, but because the logistics still feel brutally demanding, even if you grant ancient societies their full capability. The Serapeum of Saqqara is where underground mystery becomes physical weight. The claim, underground galleries containing enormous granite boxes, often discussed in the range of tens of tons per piece, with some descriptions placing them far higher when lids are included. These are real objects in a real underground setting, massive stone inside tight corridors. The mainstream interpretation connects the Serapeum to the cult of the Apis bull and burial tradition, offering a coherent religious framework for why such a place exists. That's the official story. But here's the but that keeps the debate alive: the workflow. Granite isn't soft local stone. It must be quarried, shaped, transported, and then maneuvered into confined underground spaces with limited room for leverage, turning, and staging. Even without exaggerating, the logistics are hard, and context complicates everything. Reports of contents and emptiness can be shaped by disturbance over time, looting, reuse, incomplete early documentation, so empty doesn't automatically mean never used, but it does keep questions open. Some modern commentators make extreme precision claims. Not all of that is grounded in mainstream Egyptological publication, so a premium approach is to separate measurable observations from dramatic conclusions. The core mismatch, aligned with the title, is this: if you imagine the tool sets and hauling methods we typically associate with the era, the Serapeum still forces you to ask how the operation was organized underground at scale, repeatedly, without leaving a clean, step-by-step construction record we can confidently point to today. And the final site is where the tension changes again, because instead of how, the argument becomes when. And when the date is debated, the tool story becomes debated too. The Osirion at Abydos is one of those places where the structure itself seems to argue with the label attached to it. The claim is that its megalithic underground construction, heavy stone elements, and a design language that some observers feel resembles older traditions creates real debate. The official attribution connects it to Seti I's complex largely through surrounding context, rather than an uncomplicated "this core is dated by a perfect construction inscription" moment. But the but is what underground sites do once again. They can be thin on the exact kinds of sealed, date-locking evidence archaeology loves: foundation deposits, construction debris, artifacts trapped in a clear sequence. When those anchors are limited, disagreement grows. Not because the answer must be supernatural, but because the evidence doesn't force a single clean conclusion. And that's where tools of the time become slippery. If you can't fully settle the timeline, it becomes harder to confidently match the construction to a specific technological context. So the Osirion isn't a punchline mystery, it's a real case file: style, context, and surviving evidence pulling in slightly different directions. And now we return to Long Yu, because it's the purest form of the pattern we've been tracking from the beginning. Long Yu is carved at scale, but the record feels too small for the effort. Derinkuyu proves underground refuge can be plausible, yet still leave coordination questions. The Hypogeum shows underground as ritual destination, where use can be broadly understood while finer details remain debated. Mitla shows how later history can restrict access and keep physical proof out of reach. Eupolinos shows what happens when purpose and documentation survive, the mystery shrinks. The Serapeum shows how underground logistics can remain impressive even within mainstream history. The Osirion shows how underground can turn dating into debate and dating into arguments about technological context. Different cultures, different functions, so what's the connecting pattern? Here it is. Underground history is often the best preserved and the least documented. The ground protects stone, but it doesn't protect paperwork. Underground spaces get reused, sealed, repurposed, built over, or discovered without the context that would make them easy to interpret. So, unexplained doesn't mean impossible, and it doesn't mean supernatural. It means the evidence is incomplete, and the case file is still open. If you could fund one careful investigation, one excavation, one long-term study, one scanning campaign, what single piece of evidence would you hope to find first? A datable layer, a tool cage, an inscription, a spoil trail, or something even simpler, proof of purpose? Because the next discovery won't just reveal another tunnel, it will reveal the missing story.